Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Emsi and ColegauCymru conference series. My name is John Gray, Director of Further Education at Emsi. I'm delighted to be joined today by Duncan Brown, Senior Economist at Emsi, and Iestyn Davies, Chief Executive at ColegauCymru. So before we get into today's session, I just wanted to quickly explain the purpose of this conference series. So as we all know, these have been unprecedented and very challenging times for everyone. And we know that leading a college through these times is exceptionally challenging. So talking this through with Iestyn and his team over recent months, we wanted to bring our expertise together to help colleges understand some of the data which will give insight to the impact on the Welsh economy. So bringing together Emsi as global leaders in labour market information and ColegauCymru as the voice of the FE sector in Wales, we've put together this four-part webinar series. So in session one, which is today, Duncan will take us through a state of the nation for Wales with analysis of the Welsh labour market and specifically looking at COVID, automation and beyond. And what he'll do within this session is highlight some of the key risks and questions to consider. Then in session two on Friday, which I hope you can all join us for again, Iestyn will convene a discussion about how colleges can lead the recovery in their local communities. And to do this, he'll be joined by three college principals from Wales and Emsi UK Managing Director Andy Derman. So that will be a great session on Friday. So this week is giving us that broad oversight. It's giving us the headline data for Wales and for our colleges to consider. And then next week into sessions 3 and 4, we then get into a bit more detail and look at how we can use labour market information to inform curriculum strategy and careers insight. So that's sessions 3 and 4, which will be next week. And for those sessions, which will be presented by myself, I look forward to be joined by some guests from our Emsi customers from our Welsh colleges. So if you have any questions for today's session, please pop them in your control panel. Hopefully on the control panel you'll see a section there for questions. Please add them as we go through the session, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can as we get towards the end. So that's enough for me for now. I therefore want to hand over to today's keynote speaker, Duncan Brown, who will take us through a state of the nation for the Welsh labour market.
Thanks, John. So what I'm going to be focusing on here is, well, the obvious question, which is COVID and what it's meant for the Welsh labour market. But then we're also going to just discuss a few of the the wider points about automation, and Brexit will be in the background as well, and those kind of further disruptions that the labour market can face, and just really to think about them and how they can kind of prepare how you can prepare for them and think about them robustly, really. So the bit that we're all immediately concerned about is about COVID. And so I just want to start off with a little bit of context about the Welsh economy as it was before COVID arrived. And so I don't think there's too many surprises here. So the first chart here has the number of jobs in each industry, and the red dots are what the jobs would be if Wales was like the UK. And so what we're really focusing on here is how and why it's different. And so what you see is that the biggest green bar for jobs in Wales is human health and social work activities. And that's pretty normal because it's always going to be a big employer. It's a very labour intensive sector. But what is interesting is that it's even more of an employer in Wales than it is nationally. So you can see there nationally it'd be about 175,000 jobs, whereas in Wales it's more like 220,000. So it's clearly a big concentration there. And the flip side of that is that the other typically big employer is wholesale and retail trade, which is still big in Wales, but is smaller than it is in the UK. At UK level, you've got kind of places like London, which have a huge retail centre. And Wales doesn't have the touristy shopping concentration that you get there. There'll obviously be variations, so there'll be more in the larger cities, but overall Wales has fewer jobs in retail than nationally. And then the third one there and I don't think this will be too much of a surprise, is that manufacturing is much bigger in Wales than it is nationally, by around 20–25% larger in jobs terms. A bit more on accommodation and food services, hotels and restaurants because of the tourist sector, and then other sort of concentrations that you've got there. Public administration and defence, so the government sector is slightly larger in Wales, and then if you go down around the middle, agriculture, forestry and fishing is about twice the size in Wales in terms of jobs than it is nationally. So although it's not a huge number of jobs, in Wales it is still much more concentrated than you see nationally. And of course the corollary of those concentrations in manufacturing and government and agriculture is that you've got some other sectors where Wales is much lower than nationally. So you can see there administrative and support, professional, scientific and technical activities, and then further down information and communication. So yeah, I mean that last one, the ICT sector, less than half the number of jobs in Wales than you would expect if it was like the UK economy. So quite an interesting mix of differences. We can also split jobs down by the kind of work that people do, and obviously there's a mix of these in every industry. You've got managers and you've got professionals, and then you've got production workers. And so at the top there, the biggest group everywhere is professional occupations, but as you can see again, the red dot represents the UK. There are fewer professional jobs in Wales than nationally, not hugely fewer, but sort of in the 5 to 10% range. Whereas there are slightly more elementary occupation jobs, fewer professional and technical jobs, and then down in the middle, more skilled trades and more caring, leisure and other service occupations. As we saw, there's a concentration of health and social work, so it's no surprise really that there's more caring jobs in the country as well. We can also look at how those types of jobs have changed over the 4 years up to 2019 to just see where the job creation is coming. And the biggest job creation is in elementary occupations, where something like around 12,000 jobs were created in that time net, which is about 7% growth. Professional occupations were second, but they are the largest, so growth is a bit slower there, 4.5%. And then administrative and secretarial, which doesn't grow that strongly across the UK, but has grown by 6.2%, so pretty large. And then skilled trades also growing well, whereas there are these other jobs further down, so sales and customer service occupations, which were in negative territory. One of the things that we collect at Emsi are online job postings. Before COVID, we were collecting around 800,000 a month. The monthly total has been all over the shop since then, so I won't attempt to guess at what the average has been since April. And we've been doing this since the start of 2016, so we've got a database of around 40–45 million job postings, and we tag them all across a very comprehensive skills library. And so breaking jobs up into the sort of these four broad categories: high skill, middle skill, service oriented and labour intensive, we can just look at what are the skills that are particularly concentrated in Wales. And one of the things that really comes out straight away is that health concentration that you've got in Wales shows through. So in high skill, you've got nursing, mental health, nursing care, social work, physical therapy and primary care. And then in service oriented as well, personal care, mental health, learning disabilities and so on. But then there are others in there. So at the middle skill level, you can see the effects of manufacturing. So you've got things in there like mechanics and carpentry, well, not so much in manufacturing, but hydraulics and MIG welding and pneumatics. And then at the labour intensive end, you've got a mix of warehousing, restaurant operation skills, and sort of that's the more general kind of service economy that sort of supports local society in large part. So that gives you a sense of the sort of the skills as it was before. But then COVID arrived in March this year and changed pretty much everything in terms of local labour markets across the country. So across the UK and then also within Wales as well. So the first way we have to measure it is just some really simple comparisons where we've set these two measures at 100 for December 2019. And the first one at the top there is the claimant count, which is the number of people that are claiming benefits. It used to be unemployment benefit, but now universal credit's arrived. It's made it a lot more complex, so you can end up on this even if you're not unemployed. And so what you see there is pretty much from March to May, the claimant count basically doubled. So we had sort of the number of people that were claiming benefit, which had been broadly stable for many years, really, up until March, suddenly just rocketed and doubled in 2 months. And it then remained fairly stable from May onwards. And what's interesting and reassuring in part is that actually the sort of the growth in the wider UK is a bit faster. Claimant count is not a good measure of unemployment these days, partly because, as I say, the fact that you can claim benefits when you're still working, and then of course the confusion of furlough as well, makes it a lot more noisy than it used to be. And so a better way of measuring unemployment is to ask people. And so the ONS goes out with the labour force survey every quarter and asks 80,000 people across the UK what their work situation is. And on that measure, we have seen quite a big increase in unemployment. So from 3% to 3.8% by August. And a bit more worrying is that this morning, just to confuse my slides, which obviously I didn't prepare at 7:30 this morning, the ONS has released a more recent figure, which is taking that up to 4.6%. So it has really gone up at quite a gallop now. So survey-based unemployment, which is people saying that they're looking for work and haven't got a job, has gone up by 50%. And I'm pretty sure, just in case anybody's wondering, that they've explicitly ruled out people who were on furlough to make sure that that wasn't counted in there. So there has been quite a big increase, and that's one of the biggest increases in the UK. I think, comparing sort of the start of the year to now, or to September, which is when the latest data is from, I think Wales has seen one of the biggest increases. But I did look at that very briefly before the presentation, so don't quote me on that. And then at the bottom there, we've got the trend of job postings. Now, job postings can be a bit of a noisy indicator because there can be all kinds of reasons why job ads go up and down. But the first thing to say is that Wales was entirely like the rest of the UK in seeing a real sort of plummet from March to May, sort of losing around a third there of the number of job postings that were in circulation. But what's reassuring actually is that Wales has actually seen a recovery beyond the levels that we've seen before. So at present, or I think these would be the numbers for October, job postings in Wales are above the level that they were in February. Whereas, as you can see in the UK, they're still only about halfway recovered. There's a couple of reasons for that we'll go on to that are unique to Wales. Another thing to bear in mind, though, is that what we're detecting is a lot lower churn on job postings, probably because of furlough. It's actually quite difficult to hire people at the moment. Or that seems to be the sort of the feedback that we get. And so actually it seems to be that job postings are sort of waiting around longer. And so that drives the number up. And so the fact that it's above the level in February is probably more reflective of it being around that level with that extra sort of hanging around quality in there as well. We can actually break that number down to see sort of the component parts of it in terms of the blue line here is the number of postings that are being added every week since the start of the year, and the green line is those that are being taken away. And you can see during the summer, you have this kind of real surge of postings coming back, while expirations, so people taking postings off, will actually lag behind. And it's only recently that it's kind of started to return to a more normal pattern like you see at the start of the year. Whether that will continue given the sort of the fire break in Wales and then the circuit break across the UK more recently, we'll have to see. This is data to the most recent week, but it normally takes a few weeks before these things filter in. It certainly did when the pandemic started. What you actually saw was, first of all, this big drop, and you can see that for April on the blue line, that new postings stopped arriving rather than old postings suddenly being withdrawn. People left postings up for a while. So, but another way of breaking it down, which is quite useful, is to see where the new postings have been materialising. And so, and this gives a similar pattern to what you see in the rest of the country, but just generally more positive. And so you see at the top, transportation and storage. Obviously, the sort of the logistics economy has fared well since COVID because more people are sort of having to buy things online and so on. Health and social work, galloping away, because obviously that's in high demand. Education remains important. Construction had a really torrid time at the start of the pandemic, but has actually recovered well when supply chains got intact and social distancing was implemented. And then down at the bottom you see accommodation and food services, so the tourist sector and restaurants, arts, entertainment and recreation as well, really sort of still hit quite hard, but not as bad as they have been at UK level. And then if we look at this in occupational terms, we see that it's kind of those elementary occupations, which, as we've seen, have generated the largest number of jobs in recent years, have returned to strong advertising. The factory sector with process plant and machine operatives is very robust as well. And so in some ways, it's quite interesting with Wales that you've got this kind of mix of sectors which are really quite insulated from COVID. So the sort of the strong health service, the strong manufacturing sector, but then you've also got quite a high level of exposure to COVID through the tourist sector as well. So it's kind of quite a split that you get there. So those skills that we were looking at before, we can also see how some of those have been changing as well. And so unsurprisingly, at the high school level, you can see nursing, mental health, child protection, learning disability are galloping away in terms of posting demand, whereas the more commercial facing ones, financial services, say, or business development, have really seen a fall. The same with service oriented. So you've got personal care, mental health, child protection, learning disabilities, use of PPE, home care, meal planning and preparation, all still solidly supported, while it's the commercial ones again that have suffered. And at middle skill, so many of the jobs are in that commercial sector rather than in the health sector, say, which tends to be either high or lower skill, that you see falls across the board. And then a more mixed pattern on labour intensive, where sort of nursing, which tends to be caring jobs, and PPE and warehousing are robust, whereas things like restaurant operation have obviously seen quite large falls. So another way we can look at the sort of the impact of COVID is to look at the sort of the industry use of furlough, and that gives us our y-axis variable here. So that's the percentage of employees at UK level, because that's where the data is strongest, have taken on furloughing as a way of avoiding sort of the impact of COVID through the last 6 months. And on the x-axis here, we use a measure called location quotient, which really measures the ratio of the share of jobs in the Welsh economy to the share of jobs in the UK economy. And so if you've got a location quotient of 1, it means the share is the same as it is nationally. As it goes above 1, it means an industry is more concentrated. And so as we saw earlier, agriculture, forestry and fishery has about twice the number of jobs in Wales than it would if it was similar to the UK economy. And so it's far out there on the x-axis, whereas information and communication is the lowest on the x-axis because it's got less than half the jobs, or fewer than half the jobs, than you'd see at the national level. And so you can see here that actually the sort of there's a real mix where you've got accommodation and food services, so restaurants and hotels, which are strong in Wales and have been really badly affected. Construction also quite strong in Wales, and quite badly affected, although there is good evidence that it's bounced back quite well. And then you've got these other sectors which Wales is strong in, like manufacturing, health, public admin and agriculture, which have been much less affected and are also strong. So you've got this quite sort of polarized kind of dimension, where the more middle affected sectors, things like transport and storage, professional, scientific and technical, are more aren't so important in the Welsh economy, and it's the sectors that are either badly affected or not badly affected that tend to dominate the Welsh economy. How that breaks down in terms of the types of jobs that are most at risk in Wales, it's fairly predictable. Restaurant roles, hairdressers, waiters and waitresses there, chefs, sports players, although if you're a Premier League footballer, not so much, and aircraft pilots and flight engineers as well. So this is on the basis of how many of those jobs take place in the industries that are badly affected. So a big question here is that hopefully, given the news yesterday, things are going to have a chance of returning to some normality next year. hopefully Pfizer's vaccine and other vaccines in development are going to arrive and going to be rolled out at great speed, and we'll see on the logistics behind that. And so during 2021, we can start to return to normal. But the issue is, what was the normal that we were going to return to? Because it wasn't like the labour market was frozen in aspic before, and it's quite possible that some of the trends that we know were happening that were disrupting our labour market are going to come back, possibly with a bit of a vengeance, because some of them might have had a bit of a kick up the backside from COVID. And as furlough gets withdrawn at the end of March now, might some businesses not return to life because actually things have passed them by. And so for the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to go through some slides around what those longer term disruptions are to just help you think about those as well. And so there are three big disruptions that sort of are in the midst of transforming our economies, really. And so the first one there on the left is automation and robotics. The middle one is about trade, with obviously with Brexit in the background, and we're getting very close to when Brexit really happens, as opposed to just the formalities of leaving the European Union. And then on the right-hand side, immigration, which has also been a big transformation in the nation's economy. And so a lot of this data comes from UK because that's the level that it's most available at. But first of all, I want to start by saying automation is an ongoing process that's been going for quite some time. We've talked a lot more about it in the last decade, but it's always been there. So here at the top, we have the typical weekly hours of people, and at the bottom, we have the total annual hours worked in the economy. And you can see that over time, from the end of the war until really the 2000s, the typical working week fell. And it actually comes in several component parts. So in the early period, it was that the actual working week was falling, whereas since the 80s, you've actually had the growth of part-time work. So the number of people who are working full-time have seen relatively little difference in their working week, whereas you've got more workers working at fewer hours. And that combines with the number of workers, which of course is changing over time too. And so you can actually see the number of hours in the economy hasn't just fallen, because that top chart makes you think of automation as being something where we just work fewer hours because the machines are doing it for us. But the bottom chart shows us it's not quite so simple, because we see that the number of total hours worked in the economy every year actually hit rock bottom in the early 80s. And then since then, has had a real kind of continued upsurge. You have a dip for the two recessions, but other than that, it's continued to grow. And that's quite an interesting sign that during that kind of 50s to 70s period, the falling working week meant fewer hours worked overall. But since then, it's changed. And it's changed for two big reasons. One is the increasing role of women in the economy. So if you go back to the sort of the 60s and 70s, then a lot more women weren't at work throughout their whole working lives. Whereas since the 80s, that's become much more the norm. And then the other side from the 90s is immigration, where we've actually seen across the UK a continued inflow of new workers, which has meant that even though the typical working hours has continued to fall slightly, actually the total hours have galloped ahead, really. And so it means that sort of the machines don't have it all their own way. We are continuing to be able to create work for people, even though, as this chart shows, machines have had a big impact. So this is for the manufacturing sector specifically. It goes from 1948 to about 2016, I think. And so the green line here is the manufacturing employment, and it's no surprise to know that manufacturing employment is a shadow of its former self. So from the sort of the end of the 60s until really the sort of the 2010s, it saw a continued reduction, really losing something like 60–70% of its employment. And yet over that same period, the output of the manufacturing sector in terms of what people are willing to pay for its goods and services was actually pretty stable. It fell a little bit in the wake of the recession and for a number of reasons in the early 2000s. But overall, there's a lot more manufacturing output per worker. And you can see that on the purple line here, which is you can see that actually from 1948 to 2016, manufacturing employment basically quadrupled in that time. And so you've had this big reduction in employment, a sort of compared to 1948, an increase in output, and together those two things mean that productivity is increased. And so you've got these two facts across these two last slides. One is that we continue to create new work, so there's no shortage of work. And then on the other hand, we've got that machines have allowed some industries, manufacturing in this particular case, to actually see rising productivity. And you can see this again here, where actually, so on the top, we've got a measure of automation, which is the capital stock per worker, the value of the machines that we have in our workplaces. On the middle, we've got growth in output per worker, so that's a measure of productivity. And then on the bottom, we've got employment overall. And what you can see is that there's no clear kind of easy pattern that goes from machines to employment. And in fact, actually, you might say that it over time, more machines means fewer demands on people. But actually, for most of the period here, from the 60s until the last few years, you've seen actually galloping capital per worker, and yet employment has continued to kind of be able to grow. And the really interesting period is right at the end, when capital stock per worker, so investment growth, has been actually really quite slow by historic standards. So the period since 2010 has been pretty poor for investment, whereas employment has grown really strongly year on year. This will be the first year where that stops since 2010 because of COVID. And probably the main difference is because of migration. So effectively, large sectors within the economy have been able to opt to expand their labour supply rather than their capital supply. And so if you think about sectors like certain parts of agriculture, they've opted for more labour intensive methods of production rather than investing in more machinery. And so what that suggests is that automation doesn't automatically go one way. It can go the other way if incentives change. But there's lots of uncertainties around, and that applies not just to automation, but to the other two as well. So automation, the first one there is technology innovation is highly unpredictable. As we've just seen, we've actually seen less investment and more employment growth in the past few years than the reverse, even though we've talked about nothing but technology innovation, and technology is all around us. And, because of COVID, so many of us are now sort of using technology in a way that we've never done before. Often technology can be invented, but can take a long time to come into use. The first computer was invented by the ancient Greeks. The Antikythera mechanism, I think it's called. It was a big mechanical computer that they found bits of, but they just did it for fun, seemingly, and didn't do anything with it. So it shows that actually, that kind of technology didn't reappear until sort of the 19th century with the early mechanical computers. And so you can see how just because the technology is there, it doesn't mean it gets used. COVID has been a big exercise in adopting technology, actually. Zoom was already there. It's just that people started using it in such large numbers. And then, as I say about immigration, economics still matters. If there's enough workers there, then technology won't be adopted. Car washes, we've had mechanical car washes for decades, and actually they've been in steep decline in the past 20 years because they've not been able to compete with manual car washes. So Brexit means that trade is highly uncertain. We don't know trading arrangements for next year for our, half of our trade effectively. For large countries, though, trade effects are all in the detail. It's kind of, very small sorts of changes in products and services can have quite a big effect. Another side of this is that the changes that might be wrought by Brexit and other trading changes can take time, because just because you wouldn't build a factory now doesn't mean you'll close it down overnight. It's still got value there because you've already invested in it. It just means that you might not expand it and you might allow it to run down. So it doesn't mean that overnight all factories close as a result of trade changes. And then on migration, we've had record levels of immigration for the past 10 to 20 years. And in the long run, labour supply creates demand. We've seen that on the previous chart. So if there are more workers, employers will look to find work for them to do because they will compete for the work that's available. But of course, that means that the economy is always being reshaped. And I said before about the agriculture sector changing to become more labour intensive because those works have been available. And so actually that means that those kind of jobs have become potentially less dependent on language, for example, because migrant workers are doing them and you don't want to depend so much on that. On the other hand, it means more workers are available from the sort of the native workforce to be able to focus on those kind of communication challenges, and so it's always reshaping the economy with it. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that when we talk about automation, it's easy to think that we're sort of at the forefront because we are an advanced economy, and we are. But actually, there's potentially a long way for us to go. So this is a measure, there's a body called the International Federation of Robotics, which captures data on how many robots are being used in factories around the world. And what you can see here is that the UK is actually around the level of advanced economies generally, but way behind the leaders. I mean, you look at South Korea, and this is robots per 10,000 manufacturing employees, and they've got about 8 times the rate of robots in factories than we have. Germany's got sort of 4 or 5 or 4 times the rate, in Japan too, and then even France is, which we consider a relatively similar economy, in Italy as well, are kind of in this sort of the 2.5 times the level of robots. Now, some of this reflects certain industries we're in manufacturing, which are more favourable to robotics, but some of it also reflects just a sort of a lack of investment, relatively speaking. And so on the one hand, this suggests that automation could have a huge effect if we just caught up with other countries. On the other hand, we haven't caught up so far, so it suggests that there are these other factors in play. To sort of measure the risk in terms of robotics, what we do is we've got data on sort of the amount of time taken in different tasks, and so these are all the task categories in different occupations. And so at the high risk end for automation, you've got things like admin work and controlling machines, operating devices, things like that. And then at the low risk end, you've got things like guiding and directing and motivating subordinates, caring for others, coaching others, thinking creatively. These are things that are not good for machines. And then you've got this category in the middle, which is a bit more ambiguous, analyzing data and information. There's always an element of human judgment there, but machines can also help you do it a lot faster. So that it's probably more of a complement to technology there. And so those are the different ways we measure technology, and we can think about how they affect different kinds of work. It's also important to know that when we talk about automation, it's a bit of a casual kind of shorthand, which doesn't really kind of summarize the whole situation. So I've just got some examples of different types of automation that are going on here, and they have very different kind of looks to them. So at the top left there, you've got modern methods of construction where you build buildings in factories and then assemble them on site. So that's automation only in a sort of a process way. The work is still being done, often by humans, but in a different setting. But it means that there's less toing and froing of work and more actual focus on the substance. Then you've got those McDonald's self-checkout machines there. They were invented in Europe, interestingly, not in America, because labour costs more in Europe, generally speaking, than America. And so they wanted a way of slimming down their workforce at McDonald's. They've now started to appear in America. But it's quite interesting because effectively it puts it means that you don't have as many workers at the checkout. It means that you actually put some of the labour onto the customer to work it out for themselves. But again, it's another form of what we call automation, but it's not just the actual machine, it's the sort of the process that goes around it. On the top right there is a picture of agriculture in the Netherlands, which is the most highly productive farming sector in the world. And if you Google Netherlands agriculture, National Geographic, there's a brilliant article on this about their use of technology. And so those fields there have just rows of lights to encourage the growth of crops, so they get a lot more yield all the time, and that's quite standard practice in the Netherlands farming sector. And so there you're using technology not to sort of take away labour, but to just multiply the results of what your farm generates, basically. Then at the bottom left, you've got Everlaw, which is software which will read lots of legal documents for you and organise them and find out things for you. So that's taking away the sort of the boring work of lawyers going through lots of documents and getting a machine to do it for you. And then at the bottom right, it's an Ocado warehouse, where those things that look like washing machines are rushing around that grid, picking up groceries and putting them into people shopping for you. So that is a purer robotic case. So these are all the different ways that technology can change the workplace. and it's not all Arnold Schwarzenegger being the Terminator, put it that way. So what I've got here is a chart that shows how different industries are exposed to technology. And so along the x-axis, we've got the percentage of work in those industries that are highly exposed in those high-risk categories. And then we can also look at how jobs have grown over time. And there's a slight drift where more exposure to technology has caused lower employment growth, but it's not sort of a simple matter. One of the interesting sides, and important for Wales, is that the industries that are less exposed are those that are not strong in Wales. So we talked earlier about IT being fewer than half the jobs in Wales than it would be at UK level, while computer programming is unsurprisingly fast growing and low exposed to automation replacing jobs. Professional, scientific and technical is also not large in Wales, so activities of head offices and management consultancy fits in that there. Whereas a lot of your manufacturing sectors are down at this bottom right, where you've got slow employment growth in recent years and really high exposure to technology. So effectively, there is that sort of squeeze of technology on them there. An interesting case in the middle at the top there is remediation activities and other waste management services, which is your recycling sector, which is quite exposed to technology, but has been growing really strongly in jobs terms in the past few decades, mainly because of regulatory change, because obviously there's a big push on for us to recycle more as a country. And so then we look at trade, and we can see how trade has been changing rapidly over time already, even before we get to Brexit. And so at the top there, you've got Slovakia, which is within the EU, and from 1999 to 2016, our trade with Slovakia in terms of imports from there grew by 2,500%, and it's now £2.7 billion. For a relatively small country, this is the effect of their opening from the Eastern Bloc and then they're joining the European Union. Slovakia has become a major manufacturing sector. Poland, which is a much bigger place, has grown by around 1,400% to now being 9.4 billion. Vietnam has grown by 1,200%. China, of course, is the biggie, and even in the period from 1999, when it had already started, it's grown by 1,000% our imports from China and now constitute £40 billion. So considering that's somewhere across the other side of the world, you can really see the changes. And so trade has been transforming the economy already, in large part, and not just with the EU either. China, Turkey is in there as well, India. And so these are big changes. This is what we talk about when we talk about globalization, and obviously that has big implications in terms of the manufacturing sector, because these are goods imports here, and it's often been manufacturing that has kind of been offshored with quite big implications for local and regional economies in the UK. Of course, the big question for the near future is about Brexit, and it's an interesting side that actually. So here is very similar to the previous technology chart, where we've got the growth in jobs on the y-axis and the share of sales to the EU, and you can see that sectors where we've got high shares of sales to the EU haven't seen big jobs growth. And so again, it's a lot of these manufacturing sectors. And so it's quite interesting that although in the short term, if there are trade restrictions with Europe, that will cause turbulence and shocks in transition, the areas where we've seen the biggest growth in our export sales to the EU haven't seen the biggest growth in jobs. And so it's quite interesting in terms of the long-term ramifications of that a reconfiguration of trade might not be so negative for jobs as we might think in the long term, even if the shock is problematic in the short term. And then finally on immigration, this is a sense of how much the sort of immigration factor in the labour market has changed. So setting 2007 as our index year, where number of employees is 100, the number of British nationals has only grown by a few percent since then, whereas the number of foreign nationals has grown by around 70% since then. So you can see how immigration has become a really much more significant part of the economy. And here we do the same again as we've done for technology and trade before. And we see that there's a much more ambiguous relationship between growth in jobs and the share of immigration, where manufactured food products, which is the most migration intensive, with nearly 30% of its workforce from foreign nationals, has actually sort of seen relatively neutral job growth in that time. And actually, there's much more of a mix here. And that's because, of course, on the one hand, industries which have affected lots of migrants are often less fashionable industries and so were in decline. But some of them have also been able to find new business models where they've been able to tap abundant labour supply. So it's quite interesting in that sense. But one of the interesting interactions in the background is that on the one hand, we talk about automation, and the same applies to trade as a potential replacement of jobs. So we can use machines to do those jobs instead. On the other hand, what we've been doing with migration is attracting workers to come and do different jobs, as I said a moment ago, some of them less fashionable jobs in many ways. And so I guess the question for the long term is how sustainable that is, because some of those jobs that we're expanding on the basis of migrant workforce might actually become automatable in the near future. And so what we do here is we take every occupation, so every dot is an occupation, and we rank them according to how reliant they are on migrants and how exposed they are to technology. And you see this quadrant on the top left where you've got chefs and care workers, for example. These are the jobs that have been relying on migrants more and more, but also are difficult to automate. And so those are the ones where it makes sense to think about migration as a potential labour supply strategy. Whereas those on the top right here, things like storage roles, waiters and waitresses, bar staff, those are the ones that, those McDonald's machines allow more automation. Warehousing has expanded greatly, but actually, as that Ocado example shows, there's robots that are coming for those jobs too. And yet we've been expanding those jobs partly on the basis of migration in recent years. And so it does lead to a question of sustainability there. So to sum up, first of all, with the COVID stuff, health, manufacturing, agriculture and government, which gives they all give Wales some strengths, which are actually relatively COVID proof. They're all sectors that are either key worker or relatively doable to socially distance. Bad but could be worse. Unemployment rising in Wales is bad, but the UK wide is worse. Wales is closing fast on the UK wide rate, as I found out this morning with the new data. So that's not quite as true as it was on Friday when I did this slide. But it's still not, as bad as some parts of the UK. And so hopefully the rise won't continue. Again, bad but could be worse, and this still remains the case. Recruitment was hit hard in the spring, but has bounced back really fast, which is good and probably reflects those strengths in health and manufacturing and so on. The hospitality sector is a concentration in Wales and is a worry, particularly affected by COVID, of course. And then on the wider disruptions, technology, trade and migration are all different paths to getting higher economic performance, and all with pros and cons. And technology is a bit of a threat and a promise, because technology is what has driven productivity growth before, from the Industrial Revolution to now. It's how we've become better off as a society, but it's disruptive. If you're on the receiving end, if you're the worker that's being replaced by a machine, then it's pretty bad. And so it's how you help people adjust to that and adapt to that that's really important. Technology doesn't work in isolation, as we talked about. More migration has probably meant that we've invested less relative to what we would have done, because labour supply has allowed a sort of more labour intensive model. And so there's knock-on consequences in different ways, and Brexit will have knock-on consequences on them all. Immediately it will have effects on trade and migration, but if we need to produce more of our low-tech goods here, for example, because we don't import them from Slovakia, then we might have less of a move to technology. And then of course a big consequence of colleges here is that all these changes in business models and the economics of it have big implications for skills demand, and the challenge is to try and anticipate what that means for you. That's me.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Duncan, for a really thought-provoking session there. There's so much detail to consider, and often easy, when we're in the middle of this COVID crisis, just to forget those kind of wider implications as well. Not that I'm suggesting any of us are doing that. Duncan, a question from me just to kick things off really is, before we hear from Iestyn, what do you think are the biggest challenges colleges will face developing curriculum over the short term?
Well, so I mean, the obvious kind of big implication is the same for everybody in the economy right now, which is working out how much of what's going on now is going to be permanent and how much of it is going to be temporary. So, you know, assuming there's a vaccine, given yesterday's news, next year, at some point the tourist sector can start to look forward to business as usual. But how much of it will be business as usual, and how many businesses will have fallen by the wayside in the meantime? And then bigger changes in terms of how many jobs are going to be work from home in the future, and how does that change the demand for different kinds of jobs? So there's that immediate kind of problem of working out how to prepare people for the near future when everything is in so much chaos. If the vaccine doesn't arrive or doesn't work as planned, then those jobs in tourism are going to be in real trouble. And so immediately you've got those kind of problems. And I think what we've done here is set out the sort of the data on what are the industries that are already recovering well. So we've seen things like manufacturing and construction, which were badly affected at first, but have bounced back pretty well. And we know that therefore that there's work to be done there, and there will continue to be so. In the longer term, it's about thinking about given those three big disruptions of technology, trade and migration, a lot of it is about adaptability. And so thinking about not only making sure that people are equipped for the job that they want, but also the jobs that they can be doing as well. And so transferable skills also become more important, because as we've grown used to in recent decades, but it looks likely to accelerate into the future, jobs aren't stable. They're going to change. Technology will change them. Sometimes technology will take them away and create new ones. And so equipping everybody with a sort of a good set of transferable skills, as well as their more specialist ones, become more important. And that also means, for example, that some of the basic skills remain very important. Being able to speak English is and Welsh and parts of Wales as well, very important, because that's kind of the natural kind of currency of work, especially in a sort of a more service-oriented economy as we have now.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. We will certainly follow the sessions next week, look at skills demand in a bit more detail. So Iestyn, just bringing you into the fore now, to put Duncan's insight into context, can you tell us a bit about what you think will be the main implications for colleges, and how you've been working with them up to date to understand and address these?
Well, thanks, John. Yes, that's a really good question, and thanks, Duncan, for that really in-depth sort of analysis of what's going on in the labour market. Yeah, well, what does this mean for colleges and colleges in Wales? Well, obviously, those of you who've been following the ColegauCymru position over now the last 4 or 5 years will be aware of the fact that we pay a lot of attention in our policy responses and helping colleges respond in terms of policy to the foundational economy, and that's that sort of mundane, day in, day out part of the economy that does supply us those kind of core health and social care, job opportunities and services. It's where construction sits, the vast majority of construction, and of course other activities that can often be quite highly skilled, but a focus around a local community and where people meet to live and work. So again, in the context of understanding this data for Wales, please expect us throughout these seminars, and indeed throughout our work leading up to the election in May, as ColegauCymru, to be looking particularly at the implications for us as colleges in terms of foundation economy. What we're also sort of looking at, of course, is the human element. All that data that you've seen, and the slides will be shared with you, all the data on those slides is actually about individuals, human beings. It's their real life that obviously that is of interest to us, not just obviously how that looks like on a graph or on a pie chart or something. So we need to be prepared to help colleges respond to the implications this has for individuals, and sometimes individuals have quite messy behaviors. They don't always follow a graph or a trend, or don't always do what we expect them to do. So we need to be prepared as a sector to be responsive to that reality, really. So yeah, these seminars, as many of you will be aware, are obviously about helping you as leaders and as managers and individuals in colleges to respond to what is often referred to as the skills demand agenda. Now, obviously, you'll be aware of the fact that sometimes colleges are accused, wrongly, we think, of simply just providing, skills supply, and there needs to be some sort of balance in terms of skill demand. Now, it's not as simple as that. It's not a simple equation of value in and value out. It's much more complex. But these seminars are about helping you to respond to that particular query and question, particularly for people like the regional skills partnerships, of course. So yeah, pay attention please to health and social care construction. We've done some work in those areas for our manifesto. We've recently done some work in agriculture and land-based for the 6 land-based colleges that we've got as part of our network. And obviously, as you're aware, be aware of the impact it's having on food and hospitality. But then please don't neglect in your response how you can be supporting local manufacturing businesses. Now, those manufacturing businesses are not technically just part of the foundation economy. They kind of sit, if you like, around it and are strengthened and supported by the foundation economy. But whether you're looking at the foundation economy or manufacturing or other things like aviation and more technologically advanced international supply chain-based businesses, the reality is, of course, Wales is an SME and a micro SME dominated economy. And what we hope to be able to do over these next 3 seminars is look at ways we can respond to the particular needs of SMEs. But I suppose at the moment, John and Duncan, my real concern is about individuals and how as colleges we can support those individuals in what are going to be incredibly turbulent times. So I would urge us in all the conversations we're having in these seminars, in the other work that we're doing as we approach next year's curriculum planning, to think about how we can support young people who we know are going to be those who are most likely to be impacted by COVID, those who are most likely to be displaced immediately from the labour market, and in particular, obviously, young girls between the age of 16 and 24, who we know in terms of industries that have been put into shutdown, are the individuals that are most likely to be affected. So just to finish, we need to think about the Welsh Government policy responses and indeed the UK Government policy responses, such as the Skills and Jobs Fund, such as the evolution of the personal learning accounts away from the 2 pilots that we ran in 2 colleges last year and towards now something that's replacing the Skills Development Fund, looking at those who are in work, but whose work earnings are obviously below average, and also then obviously how we would be looking to be delivering new employability programs if and when, probably if these days, if those attended successfully, how can colleges help work in that environment as well as of course as being the major provider of work-based learning. So lots of challenges there, Duncan, based on your information, and something we can get our heads around by using Emsi's data, John. So I'm really looking forward to the rest of these seminars to make sure that we can actually sort of take that knowledge, because knowledge itself is not power, of course. It's the strategic application of knowledge that's power, and power we want to put in your hands as colleges, and ultimately to put in the hands of your individual learners in your institutions across Wales.
Excellent, thanks so much for that, Iestyn, and definitely we've set those next 3 sessions up quite nicely there with how to explore the information from today in more detail. Certainly for those of you who are joining the session on Friday, please think of some questions to put to Iestyn in the panel. So just last few minutes to finish off now, we have had a few questions come through. We might not get a chance to answer all of these, so if we don't, we'll try to provide an answer to the individuals later on. So the first one, probably one for Duncan, and quite a complex question. So this is saying, due to the combinatorial exponential technological developments, are we not heading towards a zero marginal cost society, as Jeremy Rifkin suggests? So put that one to Duncan. If we've not got time for that, pick that one up offline.
So yeah, it's early in the morning for that. I don't know. I think that these kind of predictions are sort of often made about sort of the end of this and the end of that, and I'm not entirely convinced that that's the case yet. Anyway, so yeah, but I'm happy to talk more about it offline rather than spend 10 minutes waxing lyrical about it for now.
Thank you, Duncan. So one probably for Iestyn, or maybe for Duncan as well. So do you feel that the new way of working for colleges has accelerated the development of digital learning and curriculum development?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we have to recognize, of course, is that education, both FE and HE provision, is itself an economic sector, an employment sector. So we need to understand, obviously, how these things are changing us as employers and as organizations. Is it accelerating? Well, clearly we are seeing, obviously, we saw almost overnight, didn't we, back in March, the need to switch to forms of blended or digital first learning in a way that maybe we'd struggled to get our heads around for quite a few years before. I can remember my first ever ColegauCymru conference. I wasn't an employee of ColegauCymru at the time. I was working for the Federation of Small Businesses, and actually there was a whole session back 5-6 years ago on digital and blended learning. But we've managed to distribute that kind of way of learning now, perhaps. But we know there's real challenges in how we do it, because there is some, obviously, clearly some technical and vocational areas where we need that essential face-to-face contact. And for every gain potentially in using technology to deliver learning, there's probably some negatives as well. So I think it just calls on us as a sector to be very responsive, to be very engaged, to make sure that all our faculty is engaged across all our campuses, to make sure they're fully aware of the challenges they're facing, and we have that laser-like focus on being able to improve outcomes for learners, not just for young people, obviously, but the increasing number of adult learners who might be coming back into college through various programs. We mentioned the PLA earlier on, but potentially coming in through other forms of employability support. And we find a way of delivering, what we call pedagogy, of course, in the sector and in education. We find a way of enhancing and enriching the outcomes for learners in a way that's relevant to their actual experience. So it's going to be, at the end, I think, the one size fits all, because already we are seeing different ways of delivering the curriculum, essentially the same content of the curriculum in different ways to different people.
Yeah, thanks for that, Iestyn. Great answer there. And Duncan, last one probably for you, just quickly. How reliably can you anticipate changes to skills demand? What's the optimal time frame for doing so? I.e., is it better to focus on short-term demands in line with program development?
Yeah, I think, I mean, at the moment, very short term is probably the best, because of the sort of the level of change that's abroad. It's quite difficult to make predictions about next week, let alone next year. But that's because this is a particularly strange year. I think normally, sort of a year or two ahead, you can make with some degree of reliability, even 3 years ahead. Beyond that, I think that you can only make predictions about skills demand that are broad. And so, that's why these questions about technology and trade and so on are useful for helping you think about what is kind of going to be going on in the background, what could be the case, and therefore about kind of future-proofing by just thinking about the sort of the broad direction of changes. It's like most things, the more detailed you're making predictions, the more liable they are to be wrong. And so doing it sort of in the short term for detail is normally fine. Doing it long term for detail is, giving a lot of hostages to fortune.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. And certainly, those of you who are interested in skills, we'll talk a bit more about those in sessions 3 and 4, looking at how they link to curriculum planning and careers insight. So just to wrap things up for today, thank you very much to Duncan and to Iestyn for fascinating, excellent contributions. Thank you to everybody who's attended. I hope you agree that it's been interesting and useful, and give you some food for thought as you go back into your institutions. And would definitely encourage you to attend the session on Friday, so session 2, where Iestyn will be convening that discussion with a series of college principals and the UK Managing Director for Emsi, Andy Derman, and we'll be talking about how we can support colleges to support their local economies as we come through this current crisis that we find ourselves in. So thanks again, everybody, for attending. Have a great day, and look forward to seeing you all soon.